Picture this. The jungle air is thick and hot enough to choke you. A Japanese tank commander wipes sweat from his brow, confident that the steel beast beneath him can withstand anything the Americans can throw his way. Then, a new sound fills the sky. Deeper, meaner than artillery or any Zero fighter. It's not just an engine. It's a roar that shakes the earth itself. Moments later, streaks of fire slice through the clouds. Rockets, screaming, unstoppable, slam into tanks below. The armor that once promised protection peels open like paper. That was the day Japan's commanders realized something horrifying. The Americans had unleashed a flying sledgehammer, the P-47 Thunderbolt. It wasn't supposed to kill tanks, but it did. And it did it so completely, so unexpectedly, that it rewrote the rules of war. This is the story of how a bulky, underestimated fighter became Japan's worst nightmare and changed aerial warfare forever. If you love stories that uncover the forgotten turning points of history, where technology, courage, and chaos collide, make sure to hit that like button. Subscribe for more deep-dive documentaries that bring World War II to life, one hidden chapter at a time. And hey, share this with someone who still thinks air power didn't decide the war, because this story might just change their mind. The air above the Pacific shimmered with heat, thick and suffocating. Jungle steam clung to everything. Japanese tank crews crouched inside steel coffins, engines humming, unaware that the sky above had just turned into a weapon. For weeks, they'd fought American troops through muddy roads and broken villages, expecting tanks, artillery, and infantry, the old, familiar enemies. But that morning, the sound that came wasn't familiar at all. It was deeper, hungrier. It began as a distant growl, rolling across the jungle like thunder. Then it grew, louder, closer, until even the tank hulls vibrated. Crews looked up, confused, scanning a sky too bright to stare into. Out of the blinding blue came a monster. A massive, silver-gray aircraft dove low, wings glinting like razors. It wasn't graceful. It didn't dance like a Zero. It was brute power given shape. The P-47 Thunderbolt. The roar turned into a scream. White trails burst from beneath its wings, rockets streaking straight toward the earth. A heartbeat later, the world below erupted in fire and steel. The first tank hit didn't explode. It simply split open, peeled like a can under a giant's hand. Shards of armor tore through the jungle, scattering leaves and men alike. The Japanese crews never expected this. Planes had always strafed them before. Bullets, maybe small bombs. But rockets? These were different. They hit with the force of artillery, but faster, crueler, unstoppable from the sky. One survivor later described it like being trapped inside a lightning strike. A flash, a shock wave, then silence. The tank that had promised safety had become a furnace of twisted metal. Above the chaos, the Thunderbolt pulled up sharply, flames reflecting off its fuselage. To those on the ground, it looked less like an airplane and more like a beast hunting from the heavens. That single attack changed everything. In minutes, a Japanese armored column that had taken days to assemble was gone. Shredded by a few passes of aircraft no one had even known could carry rockets. When word reached Japanese command posts, disbelief turned to panic. Their tanks, once symbols of strength, were suddenly fragile. Armor meant nothing against fire that fell from the clouds. American pilots called their P-47s jugs, partly for their bulky shape, partly because they could take punishment and keep flying. But to the Japanese below, they were thunder-made flesh. Each new sortie came with the same rhythm, the distant rumble, the sharp dive, the flash of rockets, then the deafening boom that shook the ground like an earthquake. It was mechanical terror at its purest. The jungle that once hid soldiers and tanks became a trap. Leaves offered no cover. Camouflage meant nothing. If you moved, if the sun caught your armor just right, a Thunderbolt would find you. Some tank crews abandoned their vehicles entirely, fleeing into the jungle. Others stayed, gripping their controls, praying the next rocket would miss. Most never got the chance to find out. From the American perspective, it was precision warfare, efficient, clinical, a demonstration of industrial might. But for those beneath, it felt like the sky itself had turned against them. By dusk, smoke rose in black pillars over the jungle. The battlefield fell silent except for the distant hum of engines retreating to base. The Thunderbolts had vanished, leaving only wreckage behind. That day marked a turning point, the moment Japan's tank divisions realized they weren't fighting an army anymore. They were fighting a storm, and from that storm, there was no shelter. Before it was feared in the Pacific, the P-47 Thunderbolt was a blueprint, a gamble scribbled on a drafting table at Republic Aviation. It wasn't meant to terrify anyone, only to outfly death itself. In the late 1930s, war clouds gathered across Europe. Nazi bombers darkened skies, and the United States needed a fighter that could climb higher, fly farther, and fight longer than anything it had ever built. Republic's chief engineer, Alexander Kartveli, stared at his first design in frustration. The P-43 Lancer looked sleek, but it couldn't handle the brutal altitudes where bombers would roam. He needed something completely different. So he did something radical. Instead of designing the plane around aerodynamics, he designed it around an engine, a monster known as the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. 18 cylinders, 2,000 horsepower, pure chaos. That engine weighed nearly a ton by itself. Most engineers would have called it ridiculous for a single-engine fighter. Kartveli called it the future. If it could survive the stress, it could dominate the sky. The frame had to be enormous, heavy, almost tank-like. Engineers joked they weren't building a fighter anymore. They were building a flying fortress that just happened to have one engine. When the first prototype rolled out in 1941, test pilots were stunned. It wasn't elegant. It was loud, broad, and unforgiving. But once airborne, it moved with terrifying confidence, like a bull that learned to sprint. At high altitude, it could push past 420 miles per hour. Pilots who once scoffed at its size soon realized it could outclimb, outdive, and outsurvive almost anything the Axis could field. The Army Air Forces loved the numbers, but hesitated at the bulk. They wanted sleek killers like the Spitfire or the Mustang. The Jug, as pilots called it, looked like it ate those for breakfast. Still, the war didn't care about appearances. What mattered was toughness, and toughness was something the P-47 had in obscene abundance. It could take punishment no other fighter dared absorb. Stories began spreading through the ranks. One pilot limped home with over 200 bullet holes in his fuselage, canopy jammed, hydraulics gone, yet the Jug still brought him back. That reputation stuck. When America entered the war after Pearl Harbor, production roared to life. Factories in New York thundered day and night, churning out Thunderbolts by the thousands. Steel, sweat, and urgency fused into history. By 1942, the first combat missions were underway over Europe. At those icy altitudes, P-47s guarded bomber formations and ripped through enemy fighters with 8 50-caliber machine guns, spitting 13 pounds of lead per second. To German pilots, it felt unfair, a tank with wings. To Americans, it felt like vindication. The lumbering machine that everyone doubted had become the backbone of the air war. But even as it conquered the skies over France, commanders noticed something curious. The Thunderbolt could carry more weight than any single-engine aircraft before it, bombs, fuel, or something entirely new. Its evolution wasn't planned in laboratories, it was written in the field. Every mission taught new lessons, every repair revealed hidden strengths. The P-47 was less an airplane and more a living experiment in firepower. Soon, talk shifted from altitude to payload. If this beast could haul bombs through flak, why not turn it loose on ground targets? The Jug was strong enough to deliver the hurt directly. What began as a high-altitude escort would soon become something far more terrifying. A flying hammer built to shatter tanks, convoys, and fortresses alike. The skies would never be the same again. When the P-47 Thunderbolt first took to the air, no one imagined it would one day terrify tank crews. It was built to fight high above the clouds, not stalk the jungles below. At first, the Jug's mission was simple: protect the big bombers, keep German fighters away, bring the crews home alive. It was the heavy escort, the muscle that made the skies feel safe. But war never stays predictable. Commanders soon realized victory wasn't just about owning the air. It was about breaking everything the enemy relied on: bridges, trains, convoys, and the steel monsters rolling below. The P-47's sheer size made generals wonder. What if this giant could do more than escort? What if it could dive from the sky and erase targets no artillery could reach? The idea took hold. At first, they tried bombs. Big, brutal, and loud. The Jug could lug 1,000 pounds under each wing and still claw back into the clouds. Bridges collapsed, trucks vanished, and trains burned. But bombs were clumsy. Dropping them on a single tank hidden beneath jungle canopy was like throwing stones into a forest. Close didn't always count. Pilots needed something faster, something surgical. Across the Atlantic, the British had already begun experimenting with a terrifying new weapon: the 60-pound RP-3 rocket. American engineers studied the design, and soon the P-47 sprouted rails under its wings. By mid-1944, the Thunderbolt wasn't just an escort anymore. It was a Predator armed with M8 and later HVAR rockets, high-velocity aircraft rockets that turned every mission into a thunderstorm of destruction. Each rocket carried the punch of a field gun shell. Fired in pairs, they could split armor wide open, shredding tanks, convoys, and fortifications that once felt untouchable. The sky had learned to strike like artillery. Pilots described the sensation vividly. You'd dive steep, the nose vibrating, the target filling your gun sight. Then, thump, thump, the rockets whooshed away. A second later, fire blossomed across the earth. It was intoxicating and terrifying all at once. Miss by 10 feet, and the explosion still flipped vehicles onto their sides. Hit directly, and the blast tore tanks apart like paper toys. Japanese armor, already thin compared to German steel, simply couldn't stand up to that kind of punishment. Even near misses ripped treads apart or cooked crews alive inside molten hulls. Training manuals soon rewrote the rules. P-47 pilots learned the art of the rocket run: approach at 5,000 feet, dive at 35 degrees, fire at 1,500, then pull up hard through smoke and chaos. Each mission felt like flying artillery on wings. The Jug no longer existed to duel enemy planes. Its purpose was to erase the battlefield itself: fast, brutal, efficient, unstoppable. Ground troops began calling them angels of death. Whenever a column of Jugs screamed overhead, soldiers ducked, smiled, and knew the fight would end soon. To the enemy, it meant doom was seconds away. The transformation was complete. The P-47 was no longer just an escort or a fighter. It had evolved into something new, a war machine that blurred the line between sky and earth. Every rocket strike proved a point written in smoke and fire. Control of the air meant control of everything beneath it. The Jug had become the executioner of steel. And as reports of shattered tanks poured in, one thing was clear: the Thunderbolt had found its true calling. The sky would never again be just a place to fly. It had become the battlefield itself. By the time rocket-armed Thunderbolts reached the Pacific, the war had turned desperate. Japan's empire was shrinking, its supply lines bleeding out. Yet its tank units still believed they could turn the tide on land. They were wrong. When the P-47 squadrons of the 5th Air Force arrived in the Philippines, the Japanese Armored Corps met a nightmare they'd never rehearsed for. Fire didn't just come from the horizon anymore. It came from above. The first major encounters happened near Leyte. American infantry advancing through the mud reported sudden flashes in the sky, followed by thunderclaps that shook the ground. Moments later, Japanese tanks vanished in blossoms of orange flame. Pilots flew low, their engines snarling like beasts. Rockets screamed downward in salvos, striking columns before the tanks even saw them. Within seconds, entire platoons were gone, twisted hulks smoldering among palm trees. To the ground troops, it looked unreal. The sky itself seemed to be collapsing on the enemy. Reports said Japanese armor melted like wax. Witnesses compared it to lightning striking metal statues. MacArthur's returning forces advanced quickly, protected by the constant presence of these flying hammers. Thunderbolts turned ambushes into smoldering craters. Convoys that tried to flee through narrow roads were erased before they cleared the jungle. By 1945, Luzon had become a proving ground for air-to-ground warfare. Each P-47 carried rockets under its wings like spears. Squadrons practiced coordinated strikes, 2 planes diving, 2 circling, the sky alive with fire. Japanese tank crews adapted by moving only at night. They hid under bamboo, parked beneath trees, even covered armor with leaves. But the Americans learned faster. Dawn patrols hunted movement the way hawks track prey. Whenever a track mark cut through mud or a shimmer of steel betrayed a turret, the Thunderbolts dove. 1 run, maybe 2, and silence followed, only smoke rising through the misty jungle. At Burma, British and American forces combined their air power. Thunderbolts there perfected the art of jungle strikes, flying through humid valleys so low their propellers chopped the treetops. Japanese convoys never stood a chance. Eyewitnesses described rockets slicing through foliage like burning arrows. Even near misses flipped tanks into ditches. Soldiers crawled from wreckage, dazed, faces gray with soot and disbelief at what modern warfare had become. Then came Okinawa, the crucible. Japan threw everything it had left into that battle. Hidden bunkers, artillery, and armored counterattacks meant to drive the Americans into the sea. But heaven fell again. Thunderbolts launched from nearby airfields screamed over the beaches. Rockets streaked down like judgment, splitting tanks before they reached the ridges. Marines below watched in awe as armor burst open like eggshells. No amount of courage could protect the Japanese crews. Their tanks had become targets, their mobility useless under skies dominated by jugs. Daylight meant death. Even twilight brought the rumble of engines hunting in pairs. For the Americans, the results were undeniable. Entire enemy battalions vanished before ground forces even arrived. Pilots joked grimly that they were running out of things to bomb. To Japanese survivors, it wasn't war anymore. It was annihilation. Diaries recovered after the battles spoke of birds of iron that spit fire and thunder that kills without warning. Morale shattered with every strike. By the end of Okinawa, Japan's remaining armor was either buried, burned, or abandoned. The Thunderbolt had turned the island campaign into a demonstration of absolute aerial dominance. The jungle no longer hid, the mountains no longer protected. And as the smoke drifted across the Pacific, one truth echoed among American pilots. The sky didn't just win battles now, it decided them. Heaven had fallen to earth, and it carried rockets. Early rocket missions were chaotic. Pilots dove too steep, misjudged distance, or fired too soon. Explosions tore through forests but missed their marks. The P-47 had the power. Now, it needed precision. Training changed everything. Manuals rewritten overnight taught new attack patterns. Dive angles, release heights, timing, all calculated with cold mathematical accuracy. By 1945, Thunderbolt squadrons could hit a tank within a 50-yard circle. Pilots practiced daily, firing at derelict vehicles or painted targets on airfields. Each run honed instincts. They learned to feel distance, not measure it, to trust muscle memory over instruments when diving through chaos. The key was rhythm. Dive, fire, pull up, roll out, repeat. Rocket runs became an art form, a deadly dance between gravity and courage. Those who mastered it could destroy convoys in minutes. They called it walking the rockets. First strike the lead vehicle, then the tail, trapping everything in between. When the second pair of planes followed, there was nowhere for the enemy to run. Japanese crews soon recognized the sound, a low growl that grew into thunder. Some abandoned tanks before the first rockets hit, diving into ditches, covering their ears as fire consumed the column behind them. Pilots saw this from above, a surreal sight, soldiers scattering like ants from burning armor. Many confessed the power was both exhilarating and unsettling. War had become frighteningly efficient. American ground forces, slogging through jungle and mud, depended on that efficiency. A radio call could summon Thunderbolts overhead within minutes. Entire ambushes disappeared beneath streaks of smoke and flame. Commanders began coordinating artillery with airstrikes, timing bombardments so tanks were destroyed before ever firing a shell. The P-47 wasn't just support anymore. It was part of the battle plan itself. During the Battle of the Bulge, Thunderbolts destroyed hundreds of German vehicles in Europe. In the Pacific, the same tactics crippled Japan's already fragile armor. The psychological weight was heavier than the physical destruction. Captured diaries told the same story. Fear of the sky. "The enemy birds of iron strike without warning," one officer wrote. "We hide by day and move only beneath the moon." Morale collapsed faster than supply lines. Crews refused daylight missions, begging to operate at night, but even darkness offered little comfort. The drone of engines haunted them like distant thunder. For the Americans, confidence soared. Pilots trusted their planes completely. Even under heavy flak, the P-47 could take punishment, return with holes the size of fists, and still make it home on one engine. The Jug became a legend, indestructible, merciless, unstoppable. Every successful mission reinforced the myth. It wasn't arrogance, it was survival shaped into steel and discipline, backed by a nation's industrial will. On the ground, Japanese engineers scrambled for answers. They thickened armor, dug deeper bunkers, camouflaged with bamboo nets. But rockets didn't need precision anymore. Their blasts alone crippled tanks and shredded defenses. The balance of warfare had shifted. Once tanks symbolized dominance. Now they symbolized vulnerability. Every new attack proved the same terrifying truth. If the sky found you, you were already dead. By spring 1945, Thunderbolt pilots barely needed orders. They flew by instinct, their attacks woven into the rhythm of battle. Each launch another stroke in the painting of total aerial supremacy. The era of tank duels and fixed lines was fading. The P-47 had shown the world that power no longer rolled on treads, it roared on wings, and its roar changed everything. By the final months of World War II, the P-47 Thunderbolt was more than a machine of war. It was a symbol of unstoppable force, the embodiment of America's belief in overwhelming power. The Pacific lay in ruins. Japan's armor burned out across shattered islands, and the Thunderbolt's echo lingered over battlefields long gone silent. Pilots returned home heroes, their aircraft scarred but undefeated. Historians would later call it the most durable fighter of the war. It wasn't just its thick armor or roaring engine. It was the perfect marriage of engineering and necessity born in desperation. The Thunderbolt had proven something deeper than firepower. It showed that innovation, when driven by survival, could reshape the very nature of war. A fighter meant for high-altitude duels became the hammer of the battlefield. Its rocket strikes rewrote doctrine. Generals saw firsthand how air power could dismantle armies before they engaged. Tanks, bunkers, and convoys were no longer threats. They were targets awaiting coordinates. After Okinawa, military strategists dissected every mission report. What worked? What failed? The conclusions were staggering. Air-to-ground rockets had achieved what no artillery could: mobility, precision, and terror, all delivered from the sky. When peace finally came, the P-47's legacy didn't fade. Instead, it evolved. Engineers took its lessons and forged the next generation. Faster jets with sleeker wings, but the same brutal philosophy of dominance. The F-84 Thunderjet, descendant of the Jug, carried rockets over Korea within a decade. Once again, armored columns fell beneath the scream of guided fury. The blueprint of destruction lived on. In Europe, NATO planners studied the Thunderbolts' campaigns. Facing the looming Soviet tank divisions, they knew the answer wasn't more armor. It was control of the air, just as the Jug had proved. Fighter bombers became the backbone of Cold War strategy. Every design, from the F-100 to the A-10, carried echoes of the P-47's rugged heart, its promise that survival favored the heavy and the fearless. Pilots who flew her never forgot. They spoke of trust, the kind only forged between man and machine under fire. The Jug could take hits, cough smoke, and still bring you home. That bond created legends. Stories of bullet-riddled aircraft landing on one wing or limping hundreds of miles on a leaking tank spread through squadrons, cementing the Jug's near-mythic reputation among airmen. For Japan, the memory was darker. Diaries found after the war revealed lingering horror. Descriptions of rockets, splitting tanks like bamboo, and birds of thunder that end all hope. Those words carried into history, a grim reminder that bravery couldn't outrun technology. Japan's post-war doctrine abandoned heavy armor entirely, choosing instead to rely on defense, alliances, and innovation in other fields. The P-47 had not just destroyed machines, it had dismantled ideas. It proved that strength wasn't measured in tons of steel, but in how quickly one could adapt to the changing face of combat. From its first roar over Europe to its final dives over the Pacific, the Thunderbolt story was one of transformation, of brute engineering turned into elegance through sheer necessity. Today, restored Thunderbolts still fly at air shows, their engines growling like ghosts from another age. Each flight is a living echo of the day the sky became the deadliest battlefield of all. The Jug's legacy endures because it represents more than victory. It represents resilience, proof that when humanity faces extinction, it builds thunder, straps it to wings, and rewrites the limits of survival.